Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the latest episode of the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is given away by its title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation of just how difficult it is to get a movie made, yet alone released. I'm going to move on straight away to the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of the podcast. We're going back to 2004 for this one. I'm going to play you a clip from the trailer, come to the story the other side of this.
2 years ago,
This your store? It's a little hard to find.
Jason Bourne walked away from his past, never to look back again. But his past never stopped looking for him.
Marie!
We're blown.
Jason, I don't want you to do this.
We don't have a choice.
Now,
Jason Bourne just popped up on the grid in Naples.
he's playing their game
He's making his first mistake.
They don't make mistakes.
on his terms.
He's doing exactly what he said he'd do. He's coming for us.
Right then. Back in the dark history of this podcast, I talked about 2002's The Bourne Identity in a previous episode, a production that you could generously say was on the troubled side. Here, I'm bringing into focus its follow-up, 2004's The Bourne Supremacy, this time directed by Paul Greengrass, based again by a novel by Robert Ludlum, screenplay credited to Tony Gilroy, but not just Tony Gilroy, and starring Matt Damon, Franca Potente, Brian Cox, Julia Stiles, Carl Urban, Gabrielle Mann, and Joan Allen. And, well, I mean, going back to 2002's The Bourne Identity, it's worth reiterating that was a film that took people by surprise. Not just that it was the hit that it was in cinemas, but the enormous amount of money it made on the burgeoning DVD market of the early 2000s. It was a film that cast Matt Damon very much against type at that point as an action star, and he certainly wasn't a proven action star when he took the role on, and also was a real leap up for then independent film director Doug Liman, who had sprung to fame off the back of Swingers and Go, and it would be fair to say he struggled with wrestling a major studio blockbuster movie. So, going into 2002, I mean, James Bond was still the go-to, really. Could the Bourne Identity break through? Well, it did. A long story short, lots of money was made. And even though they'd not gone into this thinking, well, we've got to get a sequel going very, very quickly, Universal Pictures is, spoilery here, a commercial organisation. So when it sniffed a few extra quid, there was the plan. Let's get moving on the Bourne Identity 2, whatever that would be. Well, the logical place for it to go was the Bourne Supremacy, the second Jason Bourne novel, again by Robert Ludlum. But none of the cast or creators were particularly inclined to make a sequel after coming off the making of the Bourne Identity, because it had been such they described it as a nightmare to make. In fact, Matt Damon, in some press interviews around the time of the original's release, was really playing down any idea of the sequel. But the sands were very quickly shifting on this one. And so Universal went to producer Frank Marshall, who'd been drafted in to help on the first movie. He wasn't there at the start. He was certainly there by the end. And Marshall would explain that with Identity, we made an intellectual spy film, a paranoid thriller, but we did it in an unconventional way. And he said putting Matt in the lead was casting against type, and he turned out to be the perfect choice. A non-traditional action hero was born in that film. And he said he proved so compelling that we wanted to continue his story. In no way was the decision to continue his story. The wheels were, let's just say, not greased in the slightest by the idea of making tens and hundreds of millions more dollars. So Frank Marshall was back to produce. Patrick Crowley was also coming back to produce as well. And the first decision to be made was getting a screenwriter back. And thus Tony Gilroy was re-employed. Now, Tony Gilroy had loosely in very inverted commas, adapted the Bourne Identity for screen, barely thumbing past the book in doing it. Gilroy was one of those that hadn't enjoyed the previous film's production. He didn't particularly get on with Doug Liman, goes the story. But this time he went into Robert Ludlum's text for Supremacy and engaged with it. It came up with, he got familiar with the text, so he knew how much he could basically ignore, that they picked out the key things they wanted from it, but still went off in their own direction. As Marshall had pointed out, we didn't set out to make a sequel. What worked so well in the first film was that so much of it was unexpected casting against type, going for something beyond a chase and action movie. So if your goal is to make a sequel to that, you've just defeated yourself, because it will be expected. So naturally, instead, they decided, the law of Hollywood sequels, to go a little bit darker, a little bit deeper. And what they did is they took a plot point from the Bourne Supremacy novel. They took one or two threads that were left behind by the Bourne Identity movie, and that was enough really to get Gilroy going. And Gilroy would explain that he wrote a long letter to Matt Damon about his ideas for this, and he explained in that letter why we couldn't do the normal things you'd do in a movie like this. And he argued you can't have a revenge movie because Jason Bourne, the character, is an assassin. Jason Bourne killed people, so he doesn't start this film with a clean slate. There's a lot of blood on his hands, so a revenge approach didn't feel right to Gilroy. And also the character of Jason Bourne, he argued, wasn't healed yet. There was still mystery to him. And all he'd done in the first film was say, in the words of Tony Gilroy, well, I know who I am, I know what I did, and I don't want to do that anymore. And Gilroy said, well, is that enough? But he took that as the starting point for Supremacy and got to work on his script. Now, one absolute that was going to be very clear about the Bourne Supremacy was that Doug Liman was not going to direct it. Universal didn't want Doug Liman. Frank Marshall apparently didn't particularly want Doug Liman. Tony Gilroy wasn't a fan. And Doug Liman, by the sounds of it, didn't particularly want Universal either. Now, I should point out that Doug Liman has gone on to make a lot of commercially successful films. Edge of Tomorrow is a terrific movie. I mean, he did Mr. and Mrs. Smith just a few years after doing the Bourne Identity. And he's long proven himself as a commercial director, but for the purpose of the Bourne Supremacy, it was just not going to happen. And in fact, it was Tony Gilroy who suggested to Frank Marshall taking a look at a British director by the name of Paul Greengrass. Now, Paul Greengrass is a known director now, but at this point in his career, his calling card was a documentary feature called Bloody Sunday, and it's a really superb piece of work. But Greengrass's background was in documentary and investigative journalism, and he'd married up that style to the telling of the Bloody Sunday film in the film that he put together. And Marshall took a look at it and just felt, well, this is different. He could bring something different to Bourne. Greengrass himself had liked the first film, he explained. He went on a date to see the first film. And so a meeting was organised that Greengrass would go to Prague to meet Matt Damon. Matt Damon was shooting the movie The Brothers Grimm at that point. And it was a very fast process by the sounds of it that brought Paul Greengrass to the director's chair of the Bourne Supremacy. And so, by October 2003, so this was just over a year after the release of the Bourne Identity, you had Matt Damon agreeing to come back. I would assume he was contractually locked in, but I don't know that for certain. Paul Greengrass was certainly on board, and the Hollywood trades were reporting an upcoming actor by the name of Carl Urban was going to appear in this. At this stage, he was best known for his work in the second of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films, but he was now going to be hired to play the villain of the piece. A couple of other bits of casting were coming together by November 2003. For instance, Brian Cox had agreed to return. Joan Allen was coming in a new role. And pre-production work was getting underway as well. That certainly for Matt Damon and Carl Urban, they were going to have to do a lot of preparation for this. They were going to have to do specific hand-to-hand training. They were having firearm training as well. And the build-up to getting these characters right on screen was quite a long one. There was a point where the script for this leaked online in early 2004, but a pretty pointless exercise really, because the screenplay to the Bourne Supremacy would change an awful lot over the course of the film coming together. And in fact, near the start of production, even though you don't see his name on the credits, Brian Helgeland, who'd won an Oscar for adapting LA Confidential, directed films like Payback, he came in to do an uncredited rewrite on the Supremacy script. And so there's a couple of sources on this, because Helgeland did a BAFTA screenwriters lecture, and he talked about how he was once called by Paul Greengrass out of the blue. And he said, I didn't know Paul. I got a phone call one day that he wanted to talk to me. He was doing the Bourne Supremacy. He was in Berlin. And he got right to the point and said he'd picked me off a list, looked at my credits. They'd promised him that he could have a rewrite of the script before he started shooting. And he said that they had put him off, and finally he demanded it. And so they promised, and now he wanted someone to come in, and thus Helgeland got the call. And this was a week before shooting was due to begin. And Helgeland described in that BAFTA interview how he and Greengrass basically stayed up for 4 days and rewrote the entire movie from start to finish. How much of that work ended up in the final script? Well, by the sounds of it, not very much at all. And Brian Cox, in his memoir, a memoir where let's just say he doesn't pull an awful lot of punches, he describes from his perspective how Paul Greengrass was in the midst of tussles between the credited writer Tony Gilroy and Brian Helgeland, who did an uncredited rewrite with Greengrass as well working on the script. And so Cox's book is called Putting the Rabbit Back in the Hat. It's worth digging out. You certainly get your fair share of war stories in this. But still, filming was in a position to get going on the 10th of November 2003. Universal was upping the spend on this one. It allocated a budget in the region of about $70 million. I mean, it would end up at $75 million. To compare that to the original film, that was about $60 million. But there was a feeling that this was the bit where you open up the franchise, make it bigger. And when it came to making the movie, I mean, Greengrass had a different approach really to Doug Liman, that he was bringing his documentary background. He also wanted street level locations for the film, that he knew that this was going to hop across a couple of cities, but he didn't want that Hollywood thing really, where you hopped across a couple of cities and then just saw the big sights. So I think we've seen in lots of movies, for instance, when you go to Paris, there's the Eiffel Tower appearing on screen, or come to London, there's the Houses of Parliament, all amazing, and blow them up and stuff like that. I'm not suggesting you do that. For the purposes of the Bourne Supremacy, what they wanted was to pick a city where they could go into the nooks and crannies a bit more. And they chose to set up the vast bulk of the shoot of the movie in Berlin, in Germany. They used Berlin as well to double for parts of Moscow for the film. And Greengrass and his director of photography, Oliver Wood, well, they were going for a more muted palette for this as well, that they wanted to change just the visual style from the original film a little bit. And that, combined with going to areas of Berlin that weren't used to having cameras pointed at them, just gave the Bourne Supremacy a bit more of a distinction against the blockbuster films that were coming out around the same time. I mean, they centred the production at the Babelsberg studios in Germany, but still for the location stuff, they primarily had to go in reverse order for this one. That filming started in Moscow, which is where, going spoiler alert, the film ends up, then Berlin, and then to the opening sequence that they shot in India, in Goa. And they spent 2 weeks in India for a sequence that took about 6 months to prepare alone. And perhaps that's why it ended up being scheduled at the end of the shoot. And for that part of the movie, they were looking for a non-European location where Bourne and other characters could easily blend in. So they considered China for a little while, ended up in Goa for that part. And as Brian Cox again noted in his memoir, he describes how he met Paul Greengrass prior to the shoot. And he said he was great, a writer-director who cut his teeth working on World in Action for Granada. And if you're not familiar with that show, that was an ITV show here in the UK, a documentary series. But as Cox wrote also, he was unprepared for what Hollywood would throw at him. Even after I warned him they'd be hiring and firing writers left, right and centre. As a result, Cox explains, he came on board fully expecting to be sacked at any second, and so he did a rather clever thing. As he writes, you remember the Moscow car chase in the Bourne Supremacy? Absolutely brilliant. One of the best in cinema history. Again, Cox's words. And he describes how Greengrass filmed that first, and it became his calling card, his way of saying, if you lose me, you lose this. It wasn't just Greengrass, of course, that was busy. There's a man called Dan Bradley, I just want to name check here, the second unit director and also head of the stunt team. And I mean, one of his biggest challenges was the chase between Jason Bourne and Carl Urban's character, Kirill, in the film. He also set up a training school for the actors just off the side of the set in Berlin so that right throughout filming, the training could be ongoing. Urban talked to an old friend of mine, Duncan Bowles, who interviewed him back in my Den of Geek days. And he talked about when he came to shoot this movie that there was a minimal amount of dialogue. And he said that it was quite skeletal on the page. And he described how it forces you to get very specific as an actor because every beat is an opportunity to convey meaning about your character. And he insisted you have to utilise every beat. Otherwise, you run the danger of having an unrealised performance and character. And he described how the Bourne Supremacy was a challenge for him, also for Matt Damon as well. Greengrass was changing the shooting style, not just in terms of colour, but also in terms of camera as well. That he was looking to go grittier. I mean, it was the go-to word of this particular decade. And so he thus shifted the vast bulk of the production to handheld cameras. Yep, we were in the era of shaky cam here, and the Bourne franchise was one of those that really pushed this particularly hard. They'd certainly be pushed back from it from audiences when they saw the final film. I mean, how much do you actually see of some of the action became a very common complaint against shaky cam. However, the style proved hugely influential. I mean, just look at the next James Bond film that followed Paul Greengrass's The Bourne Supremacy. That would be Casino Royale. You get your shaky cam for your money there. Christopher Nolan employed it for action sequences in The Dark Knight, and it was one of the tools and a half that was used in blockbuster cinema in this particular era. Now, there was also an equipment challenge with just the intimacy, not in that way, of the way that Greengrass wanted to shoot moments. And I cede to the press notes that I discovered for this one, because it talked about utilising something called a Go Mobile, which is described as a high-speed, low centre of gravity, chassis replacement, stunt driving camera platform that was fabricated by a company called Go Stunts Inc. And this was for a lot of the vehicular stunts in the movie. It was piloted, as it describes, by a stunt driver from a movable cockpit. And what this was allowing Greengrass and his team was, quote, a myriad of camera placement around the car or truck, filming the driver or actor from countless angles. It also added that the footage shot captures the very realistic forces exerted on the actor inside a vehicle travelling at high speeds while executing quick turns, fast accelerations and sudden stops. And the end effect of it was the car appears to be driven in, quote, a breathless, reckless fashion, when in fact, because of this equipment they were deploying, and it wasn't commonly used at this point, it was always within, quote, the expert control of the externally mounted stunt driver. Damon, as he was with the Bourne Identity, was fully engaged with this and very much an action star, building up his action star persona. And he was also so fully engaged with the role that, I mean, one particular scene, he ended up breaking the nose of one of his fellow performers, in this case, an actor by the name of Tim Griffin, who was taking on the role of a CIA investigator we see in the film. And this was a sequence that Greengrass, Damon and Griffin had been involved, and Dan Bradley, of course, had been involved in rehearsing for 3 days just to get the scene right. But here's shining the limelight on the difference sometimes between rehearsal and actually getting to a set. The problem they found was that the room they'd rehearsed this sequence in was actually bigger than the one that they shot it in. And so the fight that was thus coordinated was in a much tighter space, and that's how the accident happened, that Griffin's nose ended up broken for real. As filming wrapped up in February of 2004, well, Paul Greengrass had a couple of different endings for the movie in the can that he could choose between. But the arduous process of editing would then get underway for this. The editors credited on the movie are Christopher Rouse and Richard Pearson, and they had a job and a half because Universal had earmarked this as one of its big summer releases, July the 23rd. 2004, and they had 5-6 months really to get this into some kind of shape. The problem was, as they were editing it, they kept finding different things that they were missing, that they were looking for. And this was particularly ramped up on the Bourne Ultimatum, the subsequent film, which I'm sure I'll come to in a future episode of Film Stories. But there was extra material they found that they needed to shoot. And so the template for what happened with Ultimatum was perhaps very much set by the ending of the Bourne Supremacy, which the one that you see in the film, and it's a terrific ending of the film, well, they came up with it very, very, very late late in the day. To quote a report that appeared in The Guardian, 2 weeks before its release, Paul Greengrass got together with its star, Matt Damon, came up with a new ending and phoned the producers saying the new idea was way better. 2 weeks before release, so we're already up to early July 2004. Now, this new ending was going to cost $200,000 alone, and also Matt Damon was on set of Ocean's 12 at the time, and he would need to be pulled off that film, brought back to shoot the extra footage for the Bourne Supremacy. Also, Brian Cox was on stage elsewhere in the world, and he would have to step off the stage one night, jump on a plane to be able to shoot this. The producers agreed in the end. And they had time after it was shot just to do another test screening. And the test screening was the results coming back from that were notably improved with the new ending added on. The film thus landed before audiences and critics in July 2004. What was the response? Well, I'm really glad you asked, because the reviews for this were really pretty strong. In particular, the critics were citing the different approach that Paul Greengrass had taken. The critical response for the Bourne Identity, I mean, that had been strong, and it's worth crediting Doug Liman with really taking things in a slightly different direction there. The pushback against that particular film was that the ending sort of lost it a little bit, that the foot comes off the gas towards the end of the Bourne Identity, whether you agree with that or not. In the case of the Bourne Supremacy, well, it was a sequel that was certainly up to the standard of the film that had come before and was actually taking a slightly different path. And as such, it got quite a lot of praise for that. It wasn't across the board rave reviews, but they were certainly strong reviews. And Universal had a degree of confidence with its film when it released it into cinemas, having spent $75 million on the negative for it, put a marketing campaign together. What would the opening be? Well, it landed July the 23rd to the 25th in first place at the American box office with $52.5 million to its name. Now, for point of comparison, that was a significant upgrade on the opening for the Bourne Identity, which had opened with $27 million, and Universal felt it had already, not unreasonably, won its gamble. I mean, look at the other films that were around in that week. The biggest competition it was up against, oh Lord, are we going to come to this in a future episode, was Warner Brothers' Catwoman movie, which opened in third place with $16 million. It had knocked, the Bourne Supremacy knocked iRobot off the top of the chart. That had had 1 week up there. Spider-Man 2 had been around for a month. That was still in the top 5, as was A Cinderella Story. And then the bottom half of the top 10 was films like Shrek 2, King Arthur, The Notebook, Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy, Fahrenheit 9/11 in there as well. But the feeling was that Bourne would have some legs, and even though M. Night Shyamalan's The Village opened the week after to $50 million worth of business, Bourne Supremacy held up $24 million in its second weekend, and that was with the Manchurian Candidate remake also opening, as well as a Harold and Kumar sequel. Michael Mann's Collateral came out the week after that. The Bourne Supremacy still hanging around, though, in the top 3. And it wasn't for a couple of weeks, really, until it even dropped out of the top 5, by which stage we were coming to the end of August. Exorcist: The Beginning was out. Alien vs. Predator was out. All the classics. The Princess Diary was eating up money. But the Bourne Supremacy, crucially, had been a financial upgrade at the box office for Universal. $176 million in the US against $121 million for Identity. $114 million overseas against $92 million for Identity, and a total worldwide cinema gross of $290 million. That was nearly $80 million more than the previous film. But of course, the previous film had earned a good chunk of its revenue and certainly its profit from its home formats release. And so for Universal, it was a bit fingers crossed on this one. Could it repeat that? Well, yes. Because 2004 going into 2005 was pretty much the peak of the DVD boom. It was 2006 was the actual peak, but at this stage Hollywood studios could greenlight movies safe in the knowledge that if they didn't perform at the box office, DVD sales were absolutely rocketing and through the roof, and they were at the point that Supremacy came out selling 5 million discs in just 7 days. Universal certainly set up quite a tasty Christmas party that year, I would imagine. But also also, it fairly quickly got moving with the idea of a third Bourne film. Now, they were sort of insistent that at the point of making the Bourne Supremacy, they weren't thinking about doing Bourne 3 in much the same way they insisted when they made the Bourne Identity. They weren't thinking of Bourne 2. But it's fairly clear that the Bourne Supremacy, no matter what words were being put out at the time, was leaving a path for a future Jason Bourne feature to come together. Thing is, though, Paul Greengrass, he was firmly on Hollywood's radar off the back of the success of Supremacy, and so soon he was landing, apparently, the director's chair on another project over at Warner Brothers. Now, that would be the film of Watchmen, the famous, much-loved comic book, and I don't think you need me to tell you that Paul Greengrass didn't end up directing Watchmen. In fact, he was lured back to the world of Jason Bourne with the Bourne Ultimatum, as was Matt Damon, which would, in theory, complete a trilogy. As we're going to hear a little bit later on when I discuss the second of the two films in this episode, it didn't complete a trilogy. I don't think I'm hitting you with a massive revelation there. However, the crucial thing with the Bourne Supremacy is in pretty much every way it delivered what a sequel is supposed to do. For the studio, it had made more money. For audiences, it had matched, perhaps even eclipsed, the film that would follow. Could lightning strike a third time? Again, you can go on the internet and look it up, or you can get a time machine, fast forward to a future episode where I will come to the Bourne Ultimatum. But that brings me to the halfway point of this particular episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. You're at the point of the podcast where I just take a breather and do some parish notices for you. So first of all, if you like this podcast and don't mind supporting it, there are 3 key ways really that you can do so outside of listening to it. Thank you for listening to it. If you want to support us financially, if you go to patreon.com/Simon Brew, you get this podcast every week, pretty much every week early. You also get the ad-free version of it as well. You find out gossip. I do a little weekly gossip column of what we're up to behind the scenes at Film Stories, and it might be turning into a bit of a year here. Can't go into much more detail at the moment. But over at Patreon, there's a little bit more information. Costing you absolutely nothing. If you can subscribe to the podcast at your podcast home of choice, things like that help enormously with independent podcasts. Likewise, if you don't mind leaving ideally a hugely positive review, thank you for all of those who've been doing that recently. It really, really, really does help with algorithms. I can't even say algorithms. That's where we are. With algorithms and bits and bobs I don't really understand, nor can I really say by the sounds of it. Film Stories is also a print magazine, and the latest issue of that is available to order now over at store.filmstories.co.uk. There's also Film Junior magazine for under 15s. I'm a huge passionate believer in print film magazines and thus have made lots and lots of them, which are available to purchase. And I'm doing another live show, this time in London in February 2023, February the 23rd at King's Place in London. More details on that you can find at filmstories.co.uk, or if you search King's Place, that will bring up the venue and you'll be able to find tickets there. But that's enough parish notices for now, I think. Let's do a bit of comedy now. I'm going to move forward to 2016, to a comedy that was supposed to launch, well, in theory, a long-running franchise, I think. Things didn't quite go to plan, but they did for a bit. Let's hear a taste of the trailer. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
What do I have on the schedule today?
You're super late for your marketing meeting.
You have to tell me these things!
I can't believe I'm gonna be late for my first soccer practice.
I'm sorry, okay? I'm trying.
Well, try harder, dude.
Good job. Good work.
The bake sale. No BPA, no MSG, no BHA, no BHT, no sesame, no soy, and of course, no nuts or eggs or milk or butter or salt or sugar or wheat.
No.
What's that now?
I'm so tired of trying to be this perfect mom. I'm done.
You said everything I've ever felt about being a mom, but couldn't say.
There's so many rules now. Don't punish your kids.
Don't say no to your kids.
We all work too damn hard trying to make our kids' lives amazing and magical. Their lives already are amazing and magical. Be bad moms.
Oh, I'm in.
To bad moms!
And that was indeed a clip from the 2016 hit comedy Bad Mums, directed by John Lucas and Scott Moore, working from their own screenplay, starring Mila Kunis, Kristen Bell, Catherine Hahn, Annie Murmelo, Jada Pinkett Smith and Christina Applegate. Now, for the start of this story, let's go back to a producer by the name of Bill Block. because in late 2014, he had produced a bunch of films and was working as the CEO of a company called QED International. Now, films made by QED on his watch had included the Brad Pitt headlined Fury, the Neil Blomkamp directed movies Elysium and District 9. And at this point, he'd secured a new funding line for a venture that was originally called Merced Media. This funding line gave him the best part of half a $1 billion to spend on films. Merced was being overseen by two men, Raj Singh and Stuart Brown. And Block had come in, who would ultimately work under the banner of Block Entertainment. He had the cash available to help them break into the movie business and make some hit films. That was certainly the plan. And Block would depart QED International to put his energies into this new venture. Now, separately, the writers John Lucas and Scott Moore, they'd been having a pretty good time of it. That they'd done some early work on films like, they'd written Disney's Chicken Little. They did an uncredited rewrite on that, for instance. They'd penned the hit movie Four Christmases, the Matthew McConaughey rom-com, Ghosts of Girlfriends Past, remember that one? But their biggest hit to this point was 2009's The Hangover, for which they wrote the screenplay. And of course, that film would go on to be a sequel machine for a while for Warner Brothers. Now, they'd been working on a couple of other projects as well, and they would actually turn down the opportunity to make The Hangover Part 2 to press ahead with what would be their directorial debut, the 2013 movie 21 and Over, which stars Justin Chon and Miles Teller and Skylar Astin, all in that one. The Hangover films would keep going, but they also had another idea for a movie coming through. And so, as they told Creative Screenwriting, since wrapping the series Mixology that they'd been involved with, they'd been bouncing ideas around for other films. And the article with Creative Screenwriting describes how they were bouncing film ideas off one another 20 per day, every day. And, as a quote in the article, during their brainstorming sessions, they discovered Bad Mums, a heartfelt comedy as if The Hangover was injected with estrogen. Now, Scott Moore explained it perhaps a little bit better to the outlet LRM Online, and he described how he and John Lucas were two married guys with kids, and he said, we were sitting around our houses trying to figure out what to write next. He said, our lives and our world seemed very boring, and it comes across well, this. When we were seeing our wives running around and trying frantically to take care of the kids, it seemed like they were in a very stressful, complicated world. And he said, we started watching on what they were doing and watching the trials and tribulations of what they were going through. And it just seemed to be much more interesting to us. Now, this is an out of context quote that I fully accept does not paint the pair in a particularly helpful way. They don't, for instance, in the course of the interview, say we got up and helped with the washing up or anything like that. However, I would point out, before we all rush to judge, that is just the context in part of the LRM Online interview. However, it doesn't sound great, does it? But they wrote the ideas down. They realised there was something there, and they did talk to their respective wives who helped with the script that they were putting together. And then they brought in a producer by the name of Suzanne Todd, who, really was kept stress testing the script that they put together. It's worth noting too that Suzanne Todd's filmography as a producer is just full of really interesting and successful films. She's on the Austin Powers trilogy. She was involved in Across the Universe, for instance, Tim Burton's hugely successful Alice in Wonderland movie. She produced that. She produced Boiler Room, which is a hugely underrated film of 2000. And also in 2000, a film from a filmmaker called Christopher Nolan, Memento. I wonder what happened to him. And so she came aboard this project, the Bad Moms project, and the script was coming together. And let's bring our old chum Bill Block back into the story, because there he was with his pot of money, and he brought that big tub of cash, and a deal was done. And by the looks of it, it was quite a fast deal as well. Both the films in this particular episode of Film Stories seem to be going at breakneck speed. And in April 2015, Deadline reported that not only had Block picked the film up, but that also John Lucas and Scott Moore were going to direct. Judd Apatow was going to come in on some degree of producing role on it. They were looking to shoot the film in the summer of 2015, and they got a star. Leslie Mann was going to headline the movie. And that was enough for Block then to be able to secure distribution for the movie. Paramount Pictures, just a month later, in May of 2015, invested in the film and agreed to pick it up. But then the speed of the story continued as if we were all on some kind of schedule, because just weeks later came the report that Leslie Mann was out and Judd Apatow was out as well. And the problem here was one of scheduling, that the pair couldn't make the film work with their respective schedules and the other projects that they were working on. Because for them to be able to tackle Bad Moms, as it was still just about known, they needed filming to begin by the middle of July 2015. And it just became clearer and clear that that was not going to be possible. As such, Apatow was out and Mann was out, and that made headlines in the trade press. Paramount was still involved, however, and everyone concerned seemed to be making noises that, oh, we'll be confident we can get someone else in and we'll still be able to shoot on time. But here's a spoiler for you. They didn't get anyone else in at that point and they weren't able to shoot on time, and the film encountered a bit of a delay. So let's move on to the autumn of 2005. We're still going quite quickly, but by this stage, Paramount Pictures was out as well. I mean, most of the 2010s, Paramount wasn't having the best of times, really. But without Apatow, perhaps it decided it was best putting its chips elsewhere. However, the project was drawing attention because in the mid-2010s, comedies headlined by women was still very much a rarity. In fact, you can argue it's still very much a rarity now. But 2010, 2011's Bridesmaids had at least cut through to the point where there was interest in other films headlined by women. It's really archaic to even have this conversation, but I'm just recounting history as it sort of happened. And by the autumn of 2015, new performers were on board this particular film. Mila Kunis was signing up, Christina Applegate was signing up, and Kristen Bell. They had 3 of the 6 main parts for Bad Moms in place. The plan was, it was still going by the working title of Bad Moms, and the press reports at the time were suggesting they were keen to change that. That didn't want that to be the eventual title of the film. And it was in October 2015 that a fresh distributor was found, a company called STX. Now, STX has not been having the best of times of late, but at this point it was hungry for interesting films that it could pick up and distribute. Its first release had actually been 2015's The Gift, a thriller I absolutely love and we'll come to in a future episode, that was written and directed by Joel Edgerton, and he enjoyed a bit of a success with that. And it had other releases lined up as well. Secret in Their Eyes, a remake. The original is great, the remake not so good. Hardcore Henry was on the slate at this point as well. But it swooped in for Bad Moms and it figured it could get the film out fairly quickly, not unreasonably so as well. This hardly the most special effects driven of films. And the idea was STX would come in and would release it in the August of 2016. Now, that was significantly less than a year away at that point, and there still needed to be some prep time built in just to work with the script, to talk to the cast, because what both John Lucas and Scott Moore were very open about in interviews promoting the film was they were a couple of guys and they were making a film about mums, and what they didn't want to do was be the guys who put their experiences on the screen, whereas actually they brought in a bunch of performers who had a better perspective on this than them, and a producer who also fitted that bill as well. So they built in that prep time, they refined the screenplay, and by January 2016 the final pieces of the casting jigsaw could come together as well, that Jada Pinkett Smith joined in. Catherine Hahn was on board as well. Una Lawrence signed up fairly late in the day too, but they had, with Annie Mumolo also in there, the key roles all sorted, and it was time to get shooting, because filming, whilst it was originally set to begin in New York, the film then would ultimately shoot in New Orleans, starting on January the 11th, 2016, and coinciding helpfully with Mila Kunis's pregnancy as well. Now, Scott Moore, let's go back to the point of perspective, because Scott Moore talked about directing a film that was from, ultimately, a female perspective. And he admitted it was a little tricky. He said, we just kept listening and we attacked it like we were documentary filmmakers. He said, we were watching on what our wives were going through. We hired a great female producer. We listened to her. We talked about her experiences. Also said the whole cast, all 6 women, are all mums. When we hired them and talked with them, we were like, bring your experiences. If something happens that was funny at home, tell us about it. We want to put it in the film. And there's a delightful example of that Christina Applegate came in one particular day of filming, not in the best of moods, because her DVR, her digital video recording system, had erased the TV show Castle. And they described she was so upset. She was like, why does it do that? And they said, I'm going to put that in. I just thought it was kind of funny on the day, but I'm still laughing just thinking about it. It's got more told creative screenwriting. And he described it as not so much that we rewrite stuff for them, but it's more like casting really funny people and then just stealing their great stuff and taking full credit for it. Again, he said that in a jokey way. But there was clearly no shortage of improvisation in the film and across the production of this, much of which seemed to make it to the final cut as well. And I should point out, Bad Moms has a really lovely sequence over the end credits where the cast bring their mums in. And I remember watching the film for the first time and being really quite moved by that. The directors were really happy to encourage the improvisation. And also, I mean, one of the most famous sequences, this is a very family-friendly podcast, so I'm going to dance around this a little bit. One of the most famous sequences in the film actually came from the brain of producer Suzanne Moore. And it concerns a gentleman's nether regions. And as Moore described, Suzanne said, I went on this date and Suzanne just dropped this bomb on us in our office. And he said it was incredible. It was clearly a scene. And it was described, let's just call it the hood scene. And if you know what it is, you know what it is. And if you don't, well, go and search for it. But don't blame me when your internet search history goes a bit awry. And he just said, we added it, we made it more ridiculous. And the argument from the filmmakers throughout was sometimes real life is never quite as fun as the movies. But in this case, her story was great. It was a great example on why having her around as a teammate of ours works so well. The filming wrapped up on March the 1st, 2016. It had shot for just under 2 months. They got a lot of material in the can, and STX had moved the release date forward to this stage to July the 29th. So they'd just taken 2 or 3 weeks off the schedule. But still, they got it edited, they got it tested, they got it released on time, and they put it before critics, this one as well. And a summer Hollywood comedy. What do you think the reviews said? They were pretty much mixed on this. That there was, again, open arms really for the slightly different perspective of the comedy, but it was still a bawdy Hollywood comedy. And there was a feeling that, certainly from some segments of the critical fraternity, that it hadn't fully maximised the potential of what was clearly a promising concept. Now, what was clearly very much praised were the performances of the lead actors who were having an absolute ball with the film. And this was a case, not for the first time on this podcast, of a little bit of critics be damned, because the film, which in the end had cost $22 million to make, would go on to be the first STX release to cross $100 million at the US box office. When it opened that weekend, what do you know? It was up against a Jason Bourne reboot. A sequel more than a reboot, wasn't it? The film Jason Bourne in 2016 that had lured Matt Damon and Paul Greengrass back to that particular franchise. Jason Bourne opened that week with $59 million, but Bad Moms held its own. $23 million opening weekend. That was its production budget. Even though the way it works was all of that money doesn't pay off the production budget, STX knew that it had a hit on its hands here, and the hope was that the film could hang on to its box office for a few more weeks. The other competition that was around, I mean, some interesting stuff was about. Star Trek Beyond had opened the week before and done all right. The Secret Life of Pets from Illumination Entertainment. There was Ice Age, Collision Course, God knows which Ice Age movie that was. Lights Out had done a decent amount of business. The Ghostbusters film of 2016 was in there. A really underrated movie as well. I do recommend checking out, called Nerve, that just landed that summer and didn't get a lot of attention. And also around, Finding Dory was still in there. The Legend of Tarzan was in the mix as well. The following week, well, could Bad Moms hold its audience? Yes, it only dropped 40% on its second weekend, despite the first Suicide Squad film opening against it. Jason Bourne had a much more dramatic drop of 62% of its business. Bad Moms crossed 50 million on its second weekend out, and it was still bringing in money right throughout the rest of the summer, even though films like Sausage Party and Pete's Dragon came along, and War Dogs and the brilliant Kubo and the Two Strings. But by the time Bad Moms left US cinemas, it had helped itself to 113 million, 70 million also from outside of the US, $183 million total box office banked for the film, and that was before it found its way to home formats as well. This was a real film, a real breakthrough film for STX Entertainment, and a really crucial one in that company's history. That, I mean, at the point that we're recording this, STX has been wound up. In fact, I'll come to that just shortly in a second. But this was a summer too where it was, I mean, it had other productions that it had got ready. That Hardcore Henry had hardly gone bananas. Free State of Jones had come out in June. That hadn't done an awful lot as well. It did have The Edge of 17 lined up for the end of 2016. That's a hugely underrated film as well. However, Bad Moms was its first bona fide breakout hit. And perhaps unsurprisingly, especially when it did strongly again on home formats, STX was very, very keen to get another one going. But STX wasn't alone on that either, because let's go back to writers-directors John Lucas and Scott Moore, that they had been considering where they could go with a Bad Moms 2, even as Bad Moms was being prepared for release. But what happened, I think, here was an exercise in how to quickly strangle a potential franchise. Because one of the big selling points of Bad Moms was we hadn't really seen this. We hadn't really seen mums behaving badly. We'd seen dads behaving badly. We'd seen the male perspective on parenthood and being a messy parent. Here was a female perspective, and that was something really quite distinctive. And so following up on that, particularly because all the cast were keen to come back as well, they got to work at great speed. And it was just over a year later, start to finish, that we got 2017's A Bad Moms Christmas. Now, A Bad Moms Christmas is, I mean, it's a sketch show of a movie, really, that Moore and Lucas would come back for. It was just a very, very thin film that cost roughly around the same, but the box office was down, and there was clearly the sense that that one had been bashed out, that it had its moments, but it wasn't as well scripted as the first film. And also, as they built up to the release of A Bad Moms Christmas, came the depressing announcement of let's do Bad Dads, as if we'd all not seen Bad Dads before. But there you go. Bad Dads was now in development. We were a burgeoning bad cinematic universe, it seemed. And Bad Dads seemed just to go against the whole point of what they were doing in the first place. They got a bit of backlash even for announcing that in the first place. In the meantime, it's worth noting as well that that Cooper and Moore were enjoying another success with Office Christmas Party that they'd done the story for in 2016. That did decent business, really. It didn't do great business, but it certainly made its money. But as far as the Bad franchise was going, there was a feeling that perhaps they'd gone a little bit close to killing the golden goose in the speed at which they got A Bad Moms Christmas out. And the depleted box office of it really just didn't help. That there was still a plan for A Bad Moms 2. There was the plan for Bad Dads. And these projects petered out, really. There was never even a formal announcement that they were dead or anything like that. They just went on the Hollywood stove and never really came off said stove either. That's not to say there wasn't an attempt to get another project going as well, because in 2018 there was the announcement of a Bad Moms TV series. I don't think we've seen that either. In April 2019, now we were going to do Bad Moms Moms. That was the working title, which brought in Susan Sarandon, Christine Baranski, Cheryl Hines, who worked on the Bad Moms Christmas films. And the idea there was, let's do a spin-off of the franchise just with the grandparents involved instead. But I think what probably got in the way of that one, another one that there was no formal announcement it wasn't happening, was first of all a pandemic popped along. You might have heard of that. And then STX sort of started to hit problems, that its release slate was, they weren't bringing in huge amounts of money for their films. They'd done some decent ones as well. Hustlers came out from STX in September 2019. 21 Bridges was November 2019. But the films just weren't breaking through, and the appetite for STX to continue making films was also in decline. Which brings us to the point now where the company itself is ceasing its film operations. That here in the UK, for instance, the office apparently has closed down, and STX as a filmmaking entity just is pretty much no more. that it would no longer be doing distribution work or marketing work, and that's left one or two projects in limbo at the point this has been recorded. But also, I just wonder if one of the casualties was the Bad Moms franchise. That, I mean, it sparked up at a point where, in the middle of a summer that wasn't full of particularly great films and was doing something different, and so it got its spark of opportunity by landing at just that point. But then it kind of, I mean, the Bad Moms Christmas certainly didn't help. But then, as they looked to develop more films under the Bad Moms banner, the world changed and STX changed. And whilst the rights may still be out there somewhere to do any more films, it's been, at the point this podcast has been recorded, over 5 years since we got the second in this particular saga. And so whereas The Hangover got to 3 films, Bad Moms has stuck at 2, with no sign really of a third one pushing forward. Don't write it off. Don't say it will never happen. But also, I don't think you should overlook just what a breath of fresh air the first film was all the way back in 2016. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can get more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can get more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories, or we're at Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online. We're at YouTube at youtube.com/Film Stories. The Film Stories website is filmstories.co.uk. That's updated every weekday with movie news and reviews and features and things like that. We're at store.filmstories.co.uk if you want to buy any of our print magazines. We've got over 50 issues for you to choose from now. We've also got a Sneakers Blu-ray available here in the UK. But that's brought me to the end, really, of this episode. There will be a special episode landing soon, as promised, with the writers and producers of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and Backdraft. They were in there as well. There is Penn Densham and John Watson. That's the next special episode to come along. And then your regular episode will be available, as usual, next week. So until then, you all look after yourselves. You all take care. Thank you so much for listening. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. You'll take care. Bye-bye.